Throughout the first half of the 19th century, the young country, the United States, continued to spread further and further west. This idea of manifest destiny, that it was our God-given destiny to spread out across the whole continent and spread our way of life and our form of democracy, was something that many Americans just totally believed in, that this was what we were destined to do. And the opportunity to build a better life for yourself by going out to the frontier and gaining land and building wealth for your family was a dream that many Americans pursued in spite of incredible dangers on the frontier. Now, although America believes that it is destined to stretch from sea to shining sea, there are going to be a number of obstacles in the way. First of all, although we had gained our independence and then purchased Louisiana territory, there was still Spanish territory, which will eventually become Mexico. The northwestern part of what we claimed was Louisiana territory would also be claimed by Great Britain as part of Canada. And then, of course, the whole North American continent was home to many Native American tribes who would desperately fight to try to hold on to their way of life. But the United States had a determination as a country and as people to spread out and to grow and move further west. And so during the early 19th century, we are fulfilling that so-called manifest destiny. Now, there are several factors that help motivate people to go further and further west. Besides just the opportunity at specific gaining land so that you could build wealth, there's also a few things that are going to drive people to go further west. First of all, the Panic of 1819. As people were moving west and buying land fairly cheap on the land that had been purchased in Louisiana, a lot of people went out, got loans, and invested in the land and bought land and started farms, and that was great. Banks were starting to make money off of these loans for people to buy land, but then there's these people called speculators that go out and they buy the land and they speculate that the value of the land will go up in value and then they can sell it. And these guys would go out there and grab the best land first, and some of them start investing in it by getting loans. They go out west, they get a loan, and they buy land that they don't intend to settle, and they expect they're going to be able to sell this to future settlers. But this becomes so widespread a practice of a get-rich-quick scheme that although there were people buying land, these speculators were buying up land and getting loans, and the banks were being very careless and allowing people to get these loans, often using the land itself as the collateral. And what ended up happening is so many people were speculating on the land that there weren't enough buyers that actually wanted the land, as many buyers as there were, and they couldn't pay back their loans. The banks couldn't get back their money, so the speculators got ruined. The banks got ruined. And then people who had put their money in banks got ruined. And this financial crisis, the Panic of 1819, was such a serious financial depression that there are some economists who actually claim it was, financially speaking, worse than the Great Depression. And when banks collapse and people lose their money, and the people even who had gone out there and bought land and tried to settle it and then lost their money, many of them were broke. They couldn't afford to stay where they were. And so that's going to drive some of them to go further west, and some of them to even cross over into Spanish territory. This will be part of the motivation to go out to Texas, even some out to California. Other motivations that you're going to see, like the Mormons, they went out, they crossed over into Spanish territory, into Mexican territory, and settled around the Great Salt Lake to get away from religious persecution. So people are heading west. Now, in this drive to go west, Texas is going to be one of the most significant places where people are going to be settling. 1821, a man by the name of Stephen F. Austin had gained permission from the Spanish government to settle Americans in the land along the border with the United States, known as Texas. The Spanish desperately wanted to fill this land with settlers because they had been unable to settle it with their own citizens for more than 200 years. of attempting. And they wanted people that would be loyal to Spain because Mexico had for a decade been at war trying to gain its independence from Spain. And so the Spanish hoped that maybe these Americans would be loyal to them and develop the country. But in the same year that he is bringing Americans to live in this land, Mexico finally does gain its independence. And fortunately for Stephen F. Austin and his settlers, he will be able to convince the new Mexican government to grant him permission to continue his colony. Now, Americans start coming to Texas, and especially once Mexico gains its independence, and then by 1824 declares that they are going to be a republic, that they are going to have a constitution with an elected government, an elected president, very much like the United States. So this gives a lot of Americans confidence that they're coming to a country much like their own, and there's opportunity. The land here in Texas is 12.5 cents an acre, a fraction of the cost of what land was in the United States. And for many, they can even escape their debts in the United States by crossing over into a new country. And so thousands and thousands of people start coming to Texas, and they start developing the land. On top of that, other impresarios get permission to bring more people to Texas. And by 1830, this region known as Texas had a major population shift. It was starting to be settled, and from the Rio Grande to the Sabine River, there were now 90% of the people here were from the United States. Now, this would be a cause for concern for Mexico, that one of their states was filling up with people from another country. But these people had come to be loyal Mexican citizens and to follow the laws and to enjoy life in a republic very similar to the one that they had been born in. Unfortunately, that's not the way things are going to work out. Although Mexico attempted to have a democracy, a republic similar to the United States, the two major factions there were Federalists, who wanted more power for the people, more power to the states, and Centralists, who wanted more power in the hands of the central government and also tended to favor the upper classes. And so these two political factions struggled for power. But unlike in the United States, where we would have elections, where one party would drive the other from power, the way it ended up working out in Mexico is one faction or the other would gain power, and let's say a Federalist president would then start making a lot of reforms, and Mexicans would start getting uncomfortable, and the Centralists would gain support. But rather than wait for an election, a general would lead an uprising. They would overthrow the president, and then they would elect that general to be the next president. So then the Centralists would be in power, and then they'd start making changes, usually taking away rights and freedoms and centralizing their government in Mexico City. And then people would get upset about that, and so a Federalist would overthrow him and get elected president. And that's the way their democracy was working for the first half century that Mexico was a country. And that wasn't quite what we expected, but at least way over here in Texas, it was miles away from all that trouble. But then the trouble started creeping into our neck of the woods. Santa Anna initially overthrows the Mexican government in the name of federalism, which most Americans would prefer, more freedoms, more rights. But then he sees the tides changing, and he's smart enough to overthrow his own government. He switches sides, becomes a centralist, literally leads the army to overthrow his own government, and then gets elected as the centralist president of Mexico. And he's beginning to take away rights and freedoms, and he starts suspending the governments of several of the states that are rebelling against him. And here in Texas, we've had some disputes over immigration into the state. They've closed at one time the border from the United States into Texas because they were getting nervous about too many Americans. And then they started actually collecting taxes that were supposed to be collected, but they had suspended taxation as we were getting our colonies started. But once they did start collecting taxes, we had disputes about the taxes, and when a clash over taxes and concerns about oppressive government cause a flare-up here in Texas, war breaks out. And to make a long story short, Santa Anna leads an army to crush this growing revolution here in Texas. And there's famously 3 major battles. The whole war lasts less than 6 months, but by 1836, Santa Anna marches north with an army. A small group of Texans at the Alamo are caught off guard at San Antonio, and Santa Anna's army surrounds them, and after a 13-day siege, he captures the Alamo, killing practically all of the defenders inside, and this is one of the rallying cries later in the war, remember the Alamo. A worse disaster for Texas south of there was a garrison of more than 400 troops around the Goliad area. And in several battles with Mexican forces, they were captured, they surrendered, and then Santa Anna ordered them to be just outright executed. He was not playing with these rebels up here. He wanted to send a message that he's not going to tolerate foreigners coming in and trying to steal Mexican soil or anyone rebelling against his government. And so he orders them executed. In the massacre at Goliad, 350 Texans are executed. So we're going to add that to the rallying cry. Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad. And the Texans are in trouble. The Mexican army, over 6,000 strong, is marching across Texas, driving everyone out of the state towards the United States. The runaway scrape Texans are running for their lives. But we're starting to raise an army. Sam Houston is putting together an army of about, by the time he fights, 1,200 men. But he gets lucky. Santa Anna makes a big mistake, and he moves ahead of his main force with about 1,500 troops to try to catch the Texas government, which has been chosen as the new government of this republic that has declared its independence. And as he moves forward with this detachment of troops, he gets several days' march out in front of the main Mexican army. He misses catching the Texas government, which escapes to Galveston, but then he hears tell that Sam Houston's army is in the area. So he marches north to do battle with Sam Houston. And Sam Houston and Santa Anna's armies meet at San Jacinto. And in a bloody, short fight, the Texas army surprises, catches the Mexican army off guard when they're not prepared. They rout the Mexican army. The battle lasts about 18 minutes. The killing lasts 6 hours. The Texans remember the Alamo. They remember Goliad. And until nightfall, they slaughtered Mexican soldiers. Santa Anna gets captured and negotiates, promising he will, if he's released, go back to Mexico, get Mexico to recognize Texas independence. Texas considers themselves independent. Surprisingly, the Mexican armies in Texas, which still greatly outnumber the Texas forces, led now by General Filosola, decide that their supply lines are too long and they can't maintain their position, and they retreat. Texas becomes a nation. The United States recognizes us. England and France recognize us. Mexico plunges back into its series of revolutions because Santa Anna is out of power. Another government takes control. But Mexico, during the next 10 years, really never is focused enough to come back and try to really seriously reconquer Texas. They never give up their claim to Texas. And Santa Anna never tried to even get the Mexican government to recognize Texas. Though he would come back to power, he would never do that. But Texas was a nation, according to many countries, just not Mexico. And immediately Texans said, hey, we want to join the U.S. and become a state. But the U.S. doesn't really want Texas. And there's good reasons for that. The biggest issues facing the United States at this time was, yes, they wanted to expand, but there's this issue of slavery that's dividing our country. Half the country is free, half the country are slave states. And in this environment, it's a very delicate balancing act. Southerners won't vote to add a territory as a state if it's free. Northerners won't vote to add a territory if it's slave. Generally, they have to make compromises and add 2 states at a time to keep the balance. And any additional territory, like adding Texas, would upset this balance. And so, while he was president, Jackson never touched adding Texas to the Union. But in 1844, this was the issue that was on the table. Texas wanted to be a state. Up here, Oregon was claimed by the United States, by Canada, the British, and by the Russians up there in Alaska. And one of our presidential candidates, the Democrat, James K. Polk, said, hey, if you make me president, I will add Texas, I will add Oregon territory, I will expand this country. And those are the biggest promises that he makes. So although the U.S. had been putting off annexing Texas, once he wins this election, the message has been sent to our leaders in Congress that the U.S. wants Texas. They want to expand. And so Congress passes a joint resolution, annexes Texas to the United States. Just one problem. Mexico didn't recognize Texas as being free. They claimed it was Mexican territory. And even if they did recognize Texas as free, this little area in gray is all Texas ever was on any Spanish or Mexican map. All this other territory between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, that had always been part of other Mexican provinces. But when we declared our independence and drove the Mexican armies past the Rio Grande, we claimed the Rio Grande, obviously, because we'd get a lot more land. And now the U.S. wanted all that land. So the U.S. decides we don't want to fight Mexico if we can avoid it. So we sent ambassadors to tell Mexico, look, we understand there's a dispute about where the border is, and we're willing to pay you for this disputed land if you'll just accept that Texas and this land is part of the United States. We'll give you a fair price. But Mexico wasn't interested in selling off their future, selling off their land, and they weren't even interested in recognizing Texas as being independent. So Mexico won't negotiate. And when they won't negotiate, there's only one way to settle this, and that's going to be with military force. So the United States ends up sending troops to the Nueces River, not into the disputed territory, but into what was the recognized border of Texas. Now, granted, Mexico still didn't recognize Texas was free of Mexico. So this violated Mexico to begin with. But at least it wasn't in the disputed territory, giving time for negotiation. But instead of negotiate, the Mexican army sent an army themselves to the Rio Grande, still separated by the disputed territory. And that gives you kind of hope that maybe they're flexing their muscle, but they're also willing to negotiate. But no, they will not negotiate. And so then President Polk orders General Zachary Taylor to move his forces to the Rio Grande. So now the forces are facing off. And when Mexico orders its force to cross the Rio Grande and defend Mexican soil, the Mexican War begins. First, a group of Americans that are sent out to scout and see where the Mexican army is on our side of the border, according to us. They're ambushed by the Mexican cavalry. And so when the message is sent back to Washington, President Polk goes in front of the U.S. Congress and he declares that American blood has been shed on American soil. Mexico is the invader, and we must defend our territory. Now, you've got to remember, that's our claim. Mexico claims this is their land. And Mexico could quite frankly make the same claim, that America is the invader and Mexican blood has been shed on Mexican soil. But since we both have a disagreement over this, and since neither one of us is willing to bring anyone else to arbitrate this, we're going to settle it by force of arms. The war will decide who is going to control this territory. And in the opening battles of the war, General Zachary Taylor defeats the Mexican army here in Texas at the battles of Palo Alto and the Battle of Resaca de la Palma. So the early battles are won by the United States, and the Mexican forces are driven south of the Rio Grande. We've secured the land that we claim. The problem is Mexico is not willing to give us a treaty to end this war. And since they will not accept yet, diplomatically, that this is our land, we decide we're going to have to march into Mexico to force them to the negotiating table to end this war. So Taylor is then reinforced, and his army of 7,000 men is sent to capture the North Mexican town of Monterey. And in the Battle of Monterey, the United States forces face off with Mexican forces and fight desperately for this city. The Mexican forces, however, are unable to hold the city. The walls are breached. The American forces enter the city, and the Mexican forces retreat. So the United States has now captured Monterey. Also, we, at this point, have sent forces marching across to capture Santa Fe, which is practically in the middle of nowhere, and then to move on to the California coast, where they're met by U.S. naval forces, and they work with American settlers who had settled in Mexican California. And when those settlers declare themselves independent of Mexico and put up a flag with a bear on it, very similar to the modern California flag, they declare themselves the Republic of California, nicknamed the Bear Flag Republic. And the U.S. immediately recognizes them as a nation, because we want this territory. And so now we've taken possession of northern Mexico, and we expect them to negotiate, but they won't. At this point, one of our old friends, Santa Anna, returns. Now, Santa Anna had, after the Texas Revolution, gone back to Mexico, laid low a few years, then became a big hero by driving the French out of Mexico, and became president again. Then he spent all the money on himself, got kicked out of the country, and he was hanging out in Cuba when this war began. He sends a message to President Polk, and he says, hey, I've got respect in Mexico, I've got connections. Give me a ride to Mexico, and I'll negotiate an end to this war for you. We sent a U.S. ship to pick him up, take him to Mexico, and when he got back to Mexico, he told the Mexican people, I'm here to save you from those evil Americans. He became president again and raised a huge army to defend the national territory. So that didn't work. Now, since he didn't solve the problem, we're going to have to actually invade southern Mexico to force a settlement. So the United States begins gathering an army at New Orleans, and that army will go down the coast, pick up the best troops from northern Mexico and leave new recruits with Taylor, and then they'll go on and invade southern Mexico. Now, the general who will lead this part of the war effort is General Winfield Scott. It wasn't that Taylor wasn't doing a good job. He was. It's just President Polk figured something out a little late. See, when you become a war hero, there's a darn good chance you might run for president someday. And what President Polk didn't think to do before he sent Taylor down there was figure out which political party he was a member of. And it turns out Taylor's a Whig. That's not the party Polk's from. So Polk decided when they had to send a new fella to go invade southern Mexico, they would find a Democrat to lead that part of the war effort. And so General Winfield Scott will lead the southern portion of the war. And so he is bringing an army to invade Veracruz and march on to Mexico City. So Santa Anna, he comes up with a plan. He is going to march north first, crush the small army that's holding northern Mexico near Monterey, and then he'll turn south and deal with Scott's army. Taylor, with new recruits now, not battle-tested veterans, knows that he's no match for the large army that Santa Anna's going to be bringing at him. So he finds a little area right in here, mountains, with a narrow pass where he can put his smaller army. And by putting his army in a small, narrow pass, the Mexican army can't overwhelm him and outmaneuver him. Instead, they'll have to fight their way through the narrow pass. And in the Battle of Buena Vista, which is fought in the mountains, the Mexican army attacks and attacks and attacks. And by the end of the day, they've actually driven the American army back several miles, captured some American cannons. Tactically, they won the battle. They captured some land. Strategically, they had accomplished nothing. The Americans still held the mountain pass. The American army still existed and held northern Mexico. And if Santa Anna wanted to finish the job, he would have to fight another bloody day of fighting, making attacks. And if he did that, he may not even have enough men left to go try to deal with Scott. So Santa Anna calls it a victory, turns around to go deal with Scott. Taylor calls it a victory. They're both right. Tactically, the Mexicans won. Strategically, the Americans won. Look at an American history book, we won. Looking at a Mexican history book, they won. But we're both kind of right. But Taylor, according to us, had won his battle. He still held northern Mexico, and he will go on and become the next president of the United States. Now, meanwhile, down in southern Mexico, after fighting Taylor, whoever won, Santa Anna then turns around, marches down south to fight Scott's invading army. But by the time he gets down there, not only did he lose men in battle, he lost men in a march north and back down south. His army's greatly weakened. He's still got a strong enough army possibly to hold off the American army. But when he puts his men into a strong position up on a hill near a future battle site of Puebla, which will be famous later for Cinco de Mayo, near that very same battlefield, he places his army in a strong position on hills, but the Americans find a way to outflank him. They outmaneuver his army, they get around behind his army, throw it into confusion. His army is defeated. Santa Anna then retreats to Mexico City, where he raises another big army. He was good at raising armies to defend the city. American forces then march on Mexico City. And the fighting for Mexico City is desperate. The people are defending their homes, they're defending their capital. And after several bloody fights to capture strategic positions that guarded the city, we finally march into the city. Santa Anna and what's left of the Mexican army retreat. Mexico forms a new government, which then begins negotiating their surrender. And the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is going to be a big win for the United States. First of all, Mexico will have to recognize that Texas is free and that the Rio Grande is the border. But they're also going to have to accept that California is free. And everything between California and Texas, the United States decides, after we had to take over so much of their country, we ought to be able to keep. But remember, as Americans, we don't believe that might makes right, that just because you have the power to take it from somebody, you should. Now, we don't believe that. You know, studying American history, we've done it a few times. But in this case, rather than take the land because we won the war, we're going to buy the land. We could have just took it, but we do buy the land. It doesn't really make Mexico feel any better about it. It makes us feel better about it. So we paid Mexico $15 million so we could say we bought this land. At least the Mexicans who are living on this land that's now part of the United States are granted citizenship in the United States. Now, as you know, studying American history, it's not going to go well for Mexican Americans being part of the United States early on, because just like once they're freed, African Americans will face a lot of segregation and discrimination. Mexican Americans throughout the Southwest face very similar circumstances, but at least being American citizens, they have some legal protections. So the United States wins the Mexican War. We've expanded now from sea to shining sea. The continental United States basically takes the shape that it has today. So the United States has grown, but now we have a problem. We've added all this land. Texas came in as a slave state, but what about California? What about all that other land in between? Will it be free? Will it be slave? At least it'll be decades before enough people move out there to make any of those territories ready to be states, right? But of course, you know what's going to happen in 1848. They're going to find gold out there in California. And the California gold rush is going to bring thousands and thousands of people rushing out to California. And California is going to be ready to be a state. And we're going to have to decide, is it free? Is it slave? And this new territory is going to heighten the tensions leading into the American Civil War.